So Ben and I are going to cover catastrophic risk modeling. Ben, over to you.
All right. Hello, my name is Ben Havelka, and I am here with Joji Paul, and we will be covering catastrophic risk modeling using FAIR.
All right, and Ben and I together, we lead the risk quantification program at Express Scripts. So we really have three main goals for this talk here. It's kind of weird standing between chairs, but still. Three goals here. One is we want to provoke your thoughts to catastrophic risk and how or why it's really important to be done. Number two is we want to draw some parallels between the FAIR ontology and the traditional CAT models. And number three is we want to leave you with some practical ways of doing it. Before you go to the next slide, Ben, I want to talk about the cats here. So since it's actually a talk about cat modeling, we thought that it's only fair to bring some feline friends with us. But interestingly enough, dragging random pictures out of the internet is actually heavily frowned upon at our place. So we decided to produce some original content. So our plan was to actually use Ben's cat, take a couple pictures and actually put it in here. But it turns out that Ben's cat is not very photogenic. So
that is a lie.
Yeah. So naturally, Ben was upset, Cosmo was upset. So we actually settled on, okay, we'll do this. We'll actually mention about Cosmo, which is actually Ben's cat, and then we'll proceed. So shout out to Cosmo. You almost made it, buddy. All right. Next slide. All right. So usually when I do slides, I actually try to start with the why before the what. But in this case, I'm actually going to talk about the what a little bit so that we can all align on terminology. So what is a catastrophe in cybersecurity? I mean, these are the black swan events that most of us know about, talk about, but rarely understand or is able to articulate in quantifiable ways. And these could be your 1 in a 100-year event, or it could be your 1 in a 250-year event. Can you go to the next slide? So the next question then is actually, well, one more point about the last slide. So real quick, advice on how you can actually create that catastrophic events. A good way to do it is to actually ask your leaders or ask your executives in terms of what are the outrageous events in terms of cybersecurity. Keep that word in mind, outrageous, okay, because that's usually the best way to actually find out the catastrophes that you could potentially have. And those could be actually related to loss of all data. It could be related to loss of all data availability or the integrity of data, which could actually lead to lives being harmed or the society being harmed and things like that. So why think about catastrophes? Well, you might ask me, gee, isn't that adding to the FUD? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's just going to make us more nervous and things like that. I would argue that it's actually contrary to that. I will come back to that point. But then let me talk about some interesting side effects of thinking about catastrophes. One, it will actually force you to think about what your crown jewels are. It'll actually force you to think about how much it's actually worth to you, how much it is worth to, in some cases, your adversaries. Two, it'll actually force you to count the cost of what will it cost me if I were to lose my crown jewels, and the cost of responding to those incidents. And three is actually that it'll force you to think about whether your breach readiness is actually ready for catastrophes. So it has some, real good side benefits. But then there is the million-dollar question too, which is really literally million-dollar question, which is how much should you buy insurance for? We heard earlier, if we don't know that downside risk, how do you know how much should we buy insurance for? So those are all actually good things that can come about by thinking about catastrophes. Now, going back to the question about FUD, let me just give you one practical example. So usually when I travel by myself. I would, drive to the airport parking garage, park my car, and I have this routine of actually closing my doors, locking everything, securing my key, so on and so forth. This time around, Ben was with me too, and we were deep in conversation. So naturally, I did not follow that, or I don't know if I followed that routine. So as I was actually, as we both got into the shuttle, I was frantically, trying to take the key out, trying to make sure that, the car is locked and things like that. And then, naturally, FUD started kicking in. The FUD demons was actually chasing me. But reason came to rescue. And the reason, and the rationale was that, the best case scenario is that my instincts actually helped me. I locked everything up, so there's no issue. The worst case scenario is that I did not lock my car, so somebody could actually steal the car. But the likely case scenario might be that the car door was not locked, so the light is on, so which means that when I get back, I might have to jump the car, right? Even in the worst case scenario, the car is insured for, so I've transferred that risk. So I would argue that when you think about catastrophes, it'll actually have the benefit of, now you know how much you could lose, and now you know that you have taken care of that by way of transferring that risk to an insurance coverage, that you will be actually in a better place. So in the next few slides, I'm actually going to turn it over to Ben. He's going to walk you through a traditional catastrophe model, how FAIR is very much aligned to a traditional catastrophe model, and then a practical tips on how to do catastrophe modeling using FAIR. Over to you, Ben.
All right, thank you. Now, the origins of catastrophic modeling date way back to the early 1800s, when residential insurers would actually hang up giant maps in their office and stick pins on that map to help them visualize concentrations of fire and lightning exposures. And as you can more or less make out from that map there depicting seismic activity in the Middle East, we have come a long way since then. However, it wasn't until the 1980s actually that models similar to their contemporary counterparts started being developed. Key to creating those useful CAT models that we use today was the advent of modern seismographs for detecting ground movements and anemometers for detecting wind speeds that are now used to feed into these mathematical computer models to represent the physical characteristics of natural events. Interestingly, sophisticated and technical computer models were actually not widely accepted until Hurricane Andrew in 1992, when unforeseen and unprecedented losses caused many insurance companies to struggle to stay afloat and change catastrophic risk modeling forever. It was then that a probabilistic approach to loss analysis became the standard way for managing catastrophic risk. Now, today's CAT models will tell you the impact of events in a variety of ways, including damage done to property, the environment, impacts to the economy, and even potential lives lost. So now, I'm imagining you're curious, how do CAT models even work? What is going on to produce something like that? Well, most modern CAT models work based on 4 modules that build upon each other. The first of which is known as the exposure data module. And this module is a database of economic exposures, including property values based on their geographic location and by coverage. This is followed by the hazard module, which is a stochastic model of natural and man-made hazards. And it represents event footprints assigned to geographic locations, each assigned a frequency of occurrence and each defined in terms of severity of a hazard at a given location. Now, the output of this module would feed into what's known as the vulnerability module. That module is another stochastic module that captures the susceptibility of assets to natural hazards. This module factors in information such as construction type, like whether it's a brick building, steel, building codes at the time of development, how many stories tall those properties are, etc. And then lastly, all of this information feeds into the finance module, which takes into account policy terms and conditions to provide an assessment of the financial risk. Okay, now after all I've said thus far, you're probably asking, how are these CAT models even related to FAIR? Well, I would contend that the loss of magnitude, or the exposure module is not all that different than the loss of magnitude side of the FAIR model. The hazard module is analogous to the threat event frequency, and vulnerability is coincidentally actually very similar to how FAIR models vulnerability. And now putting it all together, the finance module bears striking resemblance to the head of the FAIR model, what we call risk. Let me dive a little deeper into these comparisons using hurricanes as an example. So when you're modeling for losses for catastrophic events, like with any FAIR analysis you do, it is absolutely key that you are explicit in your scope. A clearly defined understanding of a catastrophe is absolutely necessary for accurate cost modeling. In the case of modeling hurricane risk, for example, a portfolio of properties along the East Coast, you need to know what are the property values that could result in loss and specific geographic locations for these properties. For us, we're concerned with where are our data centers located, what sort of data do we have there, how much of it, how many records, and what is the value of those records. With this in mind, what are the primary and secondary losses in your defined catastrophe that you're interested in? Understand that your spectrum of losses is going to be shifted to the upper end of what your company could experience, and you are almost certainly going to have modeled losses that make you feel uncomfortable when you're considering these catastrophic events. Now, the hazard module is similar to threat event frequency in that you are modeling for events that could result in catastrophe. Again, when developing the scope of your CAT analysis, think, what threats could result in catastrophe for your business? And then you're going to be modeling for those threats. In modeling the hazard module for hurricane risk, it'll output the most likely locations that a hurricane is to make landfall. And if a hurricane of a given severity does make landfall, what are the effects at the geographic locations where my assets of interest are? This would include information such as maximum wind speeds, potential rainfall at the location where my assets are located. Bringing it back to technology though, in your environment, are you vulnerable to script kiddies running exploits so that they can cause chaos within your network? Do you have data that's of interest to nation state attackers? Or is the most likely threat actor to cause chaos somewhere in the middle? Now, you may not have data this granular, however, leverage what historical data you have, but acknowledge now that that alone is not going to be sufficient. Any business with a wealth of data on catastrophes that they've experienced is surely no longer in business. So it is vital to leverage your experts' input into the likelihood of these events occurring, and in particular, calibrated experts in your company, those trained and with a proven track record of subjectively assessing odds accurately, who can take in the limited data that your company does have and extrapolate that into a reasonable spectrum of probabilities. The blue team within your InfoSec department can prove to be invaluable in this regard. Vulnerability in both CAT modeling and in FAIR addresses the question of how susceptible are your assets to threat, whether that be natural disasters or malicious attackers. CAT modelers will use what they call vulnerability curves to assess the spectrum of possible damage that can occur to properties in their portfolio based on the severity of catastrophes and mitigation factors in place for a given property. FAIR's threat capability continuum is remarkably similar. Instead of sea surface temperatures and maximum wind speeds, we have the threat capability spectrum to model. And in place for reinforced concrete and modern roofing shingles, consider your company's personal resistance strength to threats and what sort of security controls you have in place to mitigate the damage should these catastrophic events occur.
All right, so thank you, Ben. To put everything together, what Ben was saying, so it's really 3 steps. One is understand what your crown jewels are, understand what hazards could be after those crown jewels, or in other words, what threats could be after them, model after those threats. And number 3 is to understand your resistance strength by way of either working at that top level and getting calibrated inputs, or if you have a wealth of data, then using that for understanding what your resistance strength is, and also to build those vulnerability curves, if you will. The last slide here, it's actually, if you have done cyber risk quantification, there's one thing that you will actually find, which is that you will be confounded with numbers. Right? In the past, if we were all able to hide behind the high, medium, lows, but now there's numbers. What do we do with those? Well, it turns out that in liability quantification, you would actually see much bigger numbers. So the best way to actually represent numbers is to actually use exceedance probabilities. It was actually mentioned so many times in this conference. I would heavily emphasize that this is the best way to actually show the output of a cyber insurance analysis. And also present the data in multiple different ways. One is actually not all executives intuitively understand probabilities. So in that case, you could translate probabilities to the return period. So for example, 1 in a 100-year event might be, or 1 in a 100-year is actually same as 1% probability, or 1 in a 250-year is actually same as 0.04% in probability. So you could actually use multiple different ways to actually show this. And also, I would actually recommend you to have an interactive way of showing this graph so that the executives can actually work through those lines and then understand what is the percentage chance that we will lose X amount of dollars in the next 12 months, which could also be answered by this particular loss accidents curve. The last thing that I would say is once you establish something like this, it will be an incredible asset to actually see how this curve is shifting year over year, month over month, or quarter over quarter, whatever frequency in which you can do it, because that'll actually be serving as your baseline, and then you can actually start seeing how it moves up or down based on the investments that you're making or how the threat landscape is changing. With that, we will go to the last slide and let you ask any questions. Yeah, good question. So I'll repeat that. The question was, in what ways was the analysis helpful in actually purchasing cyber insurance? So what we did was exactly what I was showing earlier. We actually presented an exceedance curve, and then we walked our executives through that, and then really asked the question, at what level do you want to insure for? And then they made a decision, and that's how it was decided on how much we should buy. Any other questions? It's really hard to see, but I think there's a hand up there. Okay.
So you can obviously go in a number of directions with this, and you're talking about risks that are very holistic and abstract and complex. What are your thoughts on avoiding analysis paralysis, so to speak, so that you can get the right summary level detail without recreating all of that research yourself? Where do you draw that line in terms of moving forward?
Yeah, analysis paralysis seems to be a really big problem. So here's what I would recommend. I would recommend actually sticking to 3 or 4 catastrophic scenarios. Okay, do not try to boil down the ocean because it turns out that when you consider 3 or 4 catastrophic scenarios, that'll actually be summing up everything, pretty much everything. And then if you are actually doing separate analyses, you can use something called aggregate exceedance probability to sum those analyses up. Do not add the output numbers from two Monte Carlo simulations. There's actually a way to mash two Monte Carlo simulations together. It's called AEP or OEP. So you can actually do that and get the output of all those scenarios. And that should actually encompass all that you should be concerned about.
Okay, thanks. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how and why you use expert judgment to supplement historical data?
How and why expert judgment? Okay.
I would say for starters, when we did this, we don't have historical data on us having all of our records compromised. So you really don't have a choice but to go to your forensics and incident response team and say, you guys have been working in, you guys know our environment better than anyone else here. You do have access to third parties and they will provide assessments, but they don't know your network as intimately as your team that's been there for years. And our team that we have, we've worked with them and making sure that they are good at providing accurate, calibrated estimates. And in our case, that's what we had to work with, was their expert judgment and opinions. Because like I said to start, we don't have any data on our records being compromised, thankfully.
Yeah, let me add one more point to that. It actually was mentioned earlier today about could you just use your number of times that somebody is hitting up against you, number of times somebody is actually probing you. Well, that data by itself is actually not very helpful unless you actually use your vulnerability curves as in your resistance strength, right? So it's actually mashing those two things up and then coming up with the left side of the equation, right? So the loss event. So since you don't have much historical data of how those two things have worked together in concert, is the reason why we actually decided to use the expert opinion. Now, there could be companies where they have that information in terms of how those things actually mash together with the threat actor. If you have that, absolutely. If you don't have that, use your calibrated experts. Any other questions?
There's one up there.
Well, I'll repeat the question.
Okay. No, I really enjoyed how you mapped it. That's wonderful. I think a lot of people do that in their data. It's nice to see the animation. But when you actually then make the decision or think about a decision on insurance, have you found it helpful to actually go back and assume that it goes into the model somehow and regenerate a curve? Or do you just kind of stop there? What would you recommend?
I'm trying to understand the question. So, so you're saying that once we make a decision on the insurance, then do you actually factor that in as a control that you have for the next analysis? I would not actually, and here's why I would not do that. Because insurance is actually that last resort of transferring risk. If you actually start considering insurance as a way to actually decide whether you should be investing in something, that is not the best way of doing your investments. I will actually give you one example. So if you have insurance, you know that there might be a lower limit and an upper limit, right? So lower limit is where the coverage starts, upper limit is where the coverage ends. So there was a question that was actually asked of us in terms of well, shouldn't we just set the lower limit as the limitation of liability in every contract that we are, writing? And my answer typically is no, let's not do that. We're not necessarily insuring for, a loss that could happen or a breach that might happen at a third party. We are actually insuring for, things that could happen in our side. If you start doing that, there might be actually issues with aggregation effects. So I wouldn't actually do that.
All right, well, if there's no further questions, and since we are in Pittsburgh, are yins ready for some lunch then?
All right, thank you all.